Weeping for his mother, the baby was already blue with cold when suddenly the hungry wolves appeared. Once, when Alexey worked as a forester, he found a small, almost newborn wolf cub in the forest. His eyes had just barely opened, and he didn't really even have teeth. Wolf cubs at this age need to be in the den. The mother doesn't even allow them to crawl out yet, and they hardly do it themselves. The wolf cub looked at Alexey with narrowed eyes. One of his eyes opened completely, and the other only half, which gave the look of the wolf cub some special cunning. Alexey looked around and found nothing resembling a wolf's lair, so the cub is clearly not himself. As they say, fell out of the nest. He was clearly dragged here, and maybe someone ravaged the dens of the wolves and stole him while the mother was out hunting. Or maybe the she-wolf herself got rid of the baby in such a cruel way. This happens if the wolf cub is born with a defect or sick. The she-wolf could get rid of him for the sake of stronger offspring. Alexey examined the wolfling. He looked rather well-fed and strong and didn't look sick at all. The forester put the find in his bosom and carried it home. He didn't even imagine what role this wolf cub and his pack would play in his life. Alexey was married, and at that moment, they were just expecting replenishment in the family. Well, that's great. When the heir is born, he will grow with the wolf cub. They were thick as thieves for the rest of their lives, thought Alexey. In the meantime, he himself fed the baby with goat's milk and warmed him at night. Several days passed since the wolf cub appeared in the house, and suddenly, Alexey's wife, Nastasia, unexpectedly became ill. She just fell down and lost consciousness. This had never happened to her before. It was only a couple of months before the birth. The forester took his young wife to the hospital. He stayed in the waiting room for several hours and nobody could tell him anything. Finally, the doctor came out. Alexey was extremely concerned about the child. You don't have to worry about the baby right now. Everything will be fine with it. Your wife, on the contrary, has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. Pregnancy affected her and the tumor began to grow. There's nothing we can do now. It's practically unsupportable. We have to wait until she is ready to give birth and then we'll see, the doctor explained. For several days, Alexey couldn't come to his senses. He couldn't understand how it happened. Why? Where? Nastasia was always healthy and didn't complain about anything. She never even had headaches. And now Alexey decided he wouldn't tell his wife anything about the tumor so as not to frighten her. What if it would go away on its own? But Nastasia came from the hospital already knowing about the disease. She tried to pretend that everything was fine, but Alexey saw how worried she was, and not least of all for the future child. Nastasia was so eager for it to live, despite the fact that it was the one that was killing her. Alex at the moment even hated his own child. But she, on the contrary, cared about the unborn baby. Nastasia had read in some magazine that an old woman lived not far from them, who treated all diseases with incantations. Of course, she insisted that Alexey take her to that woman. The old woman told Nastasia that conspiracies wouldn't help her. But there are remedies, some kind of odolin grass. But here's the problem. No one else can get this herb except Nastasia herself, otherwise it won't work. Well, where will she go in such a bad state of health? I remember then Alexey thought, well, right, the old woman, just like the doctors, wasn't sure that Nastasia would live to the end of her pregnancy, so she came up with some fairy tale about the herb. But Nastasia believed it. She waited for the moment when Alexey goes to work and went into the woods. He didn't let her go anywhere. She wrote him a note and went in search of this mythical cure. Oh, how he reproached himself afterwards when he read the note. He should have, in spite of everything, locked the door, nailed the windows shut, so that she wouldn't go anywhere. He couldn't imagine in the 21st century an adult woman would believe in some kind of nonsense. When it got dark, Nastasia never came home. Alexey panicked. Nastasia was born in this village and knew all the countryside and forest like the back of her hand, even better than Alexey, who although was a forester but a newcomer. He realized that something happened and has to look for Nastasia. But where? Where had she gone? In what place did she decide to look for this healing herb? If only she knew what kind of herb it was and where it grew. It wasn't time to go to the library and rummage through reference books on medicinal herbs and study folk art. Alexey went in search of it. Yes, at night. Yes, alone. but his wife and unborn child were in the woods. Could he have stayed home? Alexey had no doubt at first that he wouldn't be able to find his wife, but he couldn't stay home either. At dawn, hungry, soaked, and worn out, he returned to the village, obviously without a find. Alexey was desperate and realized that he needed to call for help. Then there were long, drawn-up statements, protocols, interrogations. Of course, the district officer began to suspect that Nastasia's disappearance was somehow connected with her husband. Alexey was talking some nonsense about a fortune teller and the magic odolin grass. Who in his right mind would believe it? Alexey himself was like on pins and needles. He felt that precious time was running out, and instead of looking for Nastasia, he was being interrogated. And then finally, only at lunchtime, the rescuers were called. Alexey rushed to search again in the front lines, but the district police officer forbade it. He decided that Alexey would now sneak off somewhere under the guise of searching. As soon as the camp at the edge of the village was set up and the first group of volunteers was ready to go into the woods, wolves came out to meet them. They were carrying a newborn baby. "Don't move," the forester shouted. He was in charge of the animals here, after all, and no one was taking away his authority. "Hold your fire," he added and raised his hand. Everyone froze. They knew the situation was a stalemate. A baby in the teeth of wild predators. One wrong move and the wolves would do irreparable damage. Alexey slowly, almost on half-bent legs, began to bypass the animals, trying to keep as low to the ground as possible. He showed the predators that he wasn't so big and didn't pose a danger. But as soon as he got 10 paces closer, the wolves took the baby and moved back the same distance. Alexey began to approach even more slowly, and as soon as the distance shortened between him and the baby, which the animals had placed on the grass, the wolves took the baby and moved back again. They put the baby back on the grass and moved literally 3 steps away, nodding their heads invitingly. Alexey knew the habits of animals quite well. He understood what they wanted. It was an exchange. The wolves were asking the man for a wolf cub in exchange for a child. "Bring the little wolfling," Alex said almost in a whisper to someone. The wolf cub was soon brought from his house and handed to Alexey's hands. He, in his turn, put the wolfling on the grass and also stepped aside for a couple of steps. Wolves immediately rushed to the wolf cub, grabbed him, and fled into the woods, leaving the baby on the grass. Alexey took his son in his arms. He waited so long to meet him. He was a spitting image of him and Nastasia. The forester immediately recognized him and knew that it was his son. Nastasia was found in the woods. Later, after almost a day, she was no longer breathing. An autopsy showed that she died of a brain tumor just as labor began, and only the wolves saw what really happened. When the woman saw her baby, all she could do is kiss it and quietly close her eyes. Time passed, but no one came, and the wolves watched as the almost blue frozen baby crawled over its mother's body, mourning her. That's when the pack leader's mind matured, the very plan of the exchange. The whole point was that the wolves knew how the alpha female had abandoned the wolf cub in the woods. This happens not only when the wolf cubs are weak, but also when the she-wolf realizes that the grown pup will become the leader. The she-wolf gets rid of competitors who will fight for the place of the leader with her beloved wolf. However, the leader knew that his days were numbered, and the pack needed a new leader. When the wolves saw the human cub, they decided to exchange it for their own, for the one the forester took, so that they could raise a new pack leader out of him, contrary to the wolves' decision. Alexey didn't know any of this. He was just happy that his child was with him. Nastasia was buried properly. Alexey and his son left our village, leaving this story as a memento for people.